So can you tell me more about it?
Right. Okay. So so here's the problem. The problem is the thing that societies need most of all. I think the core practice of journalism is called public interest journalism, which is really not a commodity in any sort of strict economic sense at all. The trouble with it is that first, it's extremely expensive and time-consuming to produce, very uneconomic in its own right. But also, it's what economists call a public good, meaning that that if you sell one item of this good, it doesn't disappear; it's still there. In other words, it doesn't disappear. The supply is not diminished. So that's one problem. And the second problem is very difficult to keep people from using that good who don't pay for it. Sort of the free rider problem. So there really isn't. It's not really a saleable commodity in any economic sense of the word. So and so how has there been news all these years? Well, it's basically been subsidized by somebody or something. Either it's the state directly through public broadcasting, but in the U.S. we moved to a advertising-based model, and in that case, we had sort of quasi-monopolies over local markets, cities and towns, where one or two newspapers held the entire market. And if you wanted to advertise to the public in that particular city, you had to take out an ad in the Boston Globe, which would or the New York Times or the Miami Herald or which charged an exorbitant amount of money. This made excess profits on the order of 20% or even 25 or 30% of revenue, which is some crazy number. It's what Google makes today. These are massive profits. And they were able to use these massive profits to subsidize essentially the news operation. That was true in broadcast as well, which had basically monopoly positions on this publicly owned spectrum. And so it hurt advertisers because they had to pay these massively high rates for for something that shouldn't have cost nearly as much. But it had the side benefit of supporting news. Okay, so for about a whole post-war period, we had 60 years, 70 years, whatever it was. It sort of worked more or less. We could rely on it. Now we know that that's actually not the case anymore. Newspapers are, the monopoly of newspapers over their markets is completely shattered. The business model is completely broken. Google came along and Craigslist and other Monster.com and other places offered the exact same service, probably even much better, like classified advertising or advertising for your store, your product. Much more effective for a fraction of the cost. And so advertisers left newspapers in droves. And if you look at the trend lines, it's just like, and it kind of falls off a cliff. And there's no real reason, there's no way to justify newspaper advertising anymore. So the advertising model is broken. Now what? So that means that essentially, which is fine. We don't care about newspapers. We don't care about the media industry as an industry. We don't really care about jobs for journalists per se. What we do care about is whether the public gets the information it needs to make informed decisions, and whether there's a cadre of professionals who can spend their time gathering facts about local government, corporations, and other things that. Healthcare system and other education and other things that affect people's day-to-day life. And so the problem is that we have not been able to figure out a way to rebuild that system that is basically in a state of collapse. So that's sort of the dilemma. How do you pay for something that is essentially uneconomic?
Can online space replace the offline space in regards of revenues? And is the subscription maybe solution?
Yeah, the answer to the question, can the online space replace the offline space in terms of revenue? The answer is basically no. The reason is that news organizations traditionally got 80% of their revenue from advertising and 20% or so from subscriptions. People's subscription was just, covering some basic costs, but the real money was in advertising. The trouble is that there's two big problems with the online space for news. One is that the rates you can charge for the number of people reading your thing have crashed online. So where you might cost, $20,000, $30,000 for a display ad in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or Le Monde, or whatever it might be. It's some fraction, hundreds of dollars or fractions of that for the same space in the website of the New York Times or online. So this is one big problem. Second big problem, though, the bigger problem, is that when it comes to digital advertising, basically two companies are dominating the entire global market. That would be Facebook and Google. They now account for more than 50% of every digital ad dollar. That's two companies. And the rest of the world gets split everything else. But they also are accounting, according to one Wall Street analyst, for the rate of growth is so fast that they're accounting for 80% of every new digital ad. So you could basically see of all of the digital ad dollars migrating to a couple of companies, with everybody else sort of splitting up the rest. And so if you are a very successful news organization in any kind of normal terms, so you get 40 million unique visitors a month, or you're the Guardian, you get 130 unique visitors a month. You're making very little money on that, and you are wildly successful. You have achieved. You've done. This is a great achievement, and yet there's very little way to convert that to meaningful money. Meaningful money in the sense that you're trying to employ not 10, but not 100, but like 500 people to make up what could be reasonably called like a robust news organization in a place like Hungary. I mean, there should be, at Lazzo is an independent news organization in Hungary. It does great work. They have about 10 people maximum. That country needs organizations with at least 100 people in their newsroom, and that's just to even just begin the conversation, just to cover the national government. Forget the state and local governments. Forget the local governments. So the digital piece of the revenue puzzle is sort of foreclosed. That's kind of a broad statement, but generally true. So you asked, okay, what about readers?
So everybody is talking about dying of all traditional media. But the question is, according to everything that you said, how the online environment can be sustainable and produce news. Right,
which is the $64,000 question. That's the thing that's the big puzzle. And my answer is first that we have to sort of at least kind of give up our hopes for digital advertising paying our way, like print advertising used to support it. That's sort of foreclosed. So I think we have to kind of, that's the first step, is sort of is acceptance. Before you have to go through denial and go through and finally in depression and all this other stuff, but finally you have to accept that digital environment is not promising and in the near intermediate term. So what is? Well, really there's going to be, you need journalism, you need a news system if you're going to run a democracy. I mean, I think most people would kind of go along with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and people, 1848 revolutionaries, and everybody else kind of understood that journalism and democracy are inseparable. So what do you do? Well, sort of the answers that seem to be emerging, at least in my head, is that readers have to be sort of one leg of this table, and maybe only two-legged table as far as I can see, or maybe two or three legs. But in theory, readers should be able to support a news publication. In practice, that's actually not the case. As I said before, readers' subscriptions made up a very small fraction of traditional media. You'd think that readers should be able to support a news organization, but in fact, they haven't been able to, with a couple of important exceptions. In the US, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and in the UK, the Financial Times have all made readers a substantial sort of part of their revenue mix. The Financial Times now has more digital revenue than print revenue, which is a quite a milestone, actually for several years. And they have more revenue from readers than they do from advertisers. So here's this kind of gold standard of the future of news, if you will. It's still got a print paper, it still sells ads, it still says digital ads, but it's moving in the direction that you kind of want, which would be toward digital and toward reader support. The New York Times has more than 1 million digital subscribers. They pay real money, not Financial Times subscribers pay serious money. They pay like $300 or $400 a year for their subscription, digital subscription. The Times people pay less, but still you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that goes directly to the newsroom, so that's good. So why can't everybody do that? I'm not exactly sure why can't everybody do that, but the fact is that everybody can't do that. In fact, very few can. The experience of paywalls and subscriptions digitally around the US has been absolutely abysmal, just so depressing, and it's just this failed experiment. Now, we have to do sort of more work to figure out whether that was horrible execution on the part of really badly run companies, which is very typical of the newspaper business. These are horribly run companies, always have been. These were monopolies for a long time. It's like the electric company is suddenly, finding its business model is crushed and trying to, or the water company, some big utility trying to become a digital, trying to transform itself into a technology company. It's just not that easy. I mean, again, I think it's fair to say that most newspaper companies were badly run anyway, because people had nowhere else to go, and they treated their customers poorly, and I mean, it was just one of those things, and they just made money anyway. Now they have to just sort of adapt, and they're just not able to do that. So we don't know whether or not the failure of subscription initiatives at local papers around the US and elsewhere failed because it was badly done, or it failed because there's something sort of intrinsic about this transaction that's just not working. So, these are good papers too, the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, where I work, they all struck out when it came to trying to get their readers to subscribe in sort of a meaningful way. That's something that we just have to, we could wish that readers would take out their credit card every day and do that. But that hasn't happened, so we have to figure out a way to do that. Having said that, there's no doubt in my mind that subscriptions and readers and some kind of country support, sponsorships or memberships or some damn thing has to contribute to some chunk of one piece of the puzzle. If you look at the most successful organizations that rely a lot on readership support, they get about 1/3 to 1/2 of their revenue from readers. National Public Radio is an example where they do these membership drives, and people kind of call in and pledge whatever they pledge, $50 or $100 or whatever, and they get a tote bag and some gifts, but they support it, and that makes up about 1/3 of their budget. The rest comes from corporate sponsorships, which is problematic, but it's a model anyway. At Lazzo, I was talking about the Hungarian thing. They get about 1/3 to 1/2 of their budget from members, readers. The rest is also philanthropy. That would be great, except it's tiny. It's tiny. So their budget's whatever it is, $300,000 or making them sort of, keeping them on the margins of sort of the media system in Hungary. So that's sort of but that's, somehow that readership subscription system model has to be fixed. And it can be fixed because in the beginning, if you remember the internet in the late 90s, everything was free. Music was free, and movies were hacked, pirated. Now, in huge chunks of the internet, people pay for what they want. They pay for Netflix, they pay for Pandora, they pay for iTunes and all the stuff. They pay. So there's no doubt in my mind that that culture of information is free seems to be kind of disappearing pretty, or at least people have gotten used to the idea of that actually everything online shouldn't necessarily be for nothing. So there's that. But the other part really, we're talking about, we're talking about we're talking about not just having places to report the news. We're talking about trying to create powerful, robust, very, significant news organizations. And if you're going to do that, it seems to me that at this point, with the commercial side having sort of hit a wall, we're going to have to turn to some other mechanism, and that would be some sort of public policy solution. Now, in the U.S., the idea of subsidizing the news is this wildly unpopular idea, both on the right, which thinks that journalism is basically a stalking horse for progressive or liberal causes, and on the left, and particularly among the news professionals themselves, who fear, of course, government interference in the production of news. My argument is that this is not like a new problem, and that people have figured out ways around it, and there are ways to do it so that even the government has almost no say over how this subsidy works. For instance, in Hungary, they have an interesting and pretty successful system that could be copied. It's too small, but that basically people can check a box on their income tax returns and devote a certain portion of their tax return or their certain amount of money, 1% of their income, I think it is, to an NGO or a news. If we did that in the U.S., if somebody put in 1% of their income and they could, and the point there is that the actual reader gets to choose who gets the subsidy. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, it's not a committee, it's not the government, it's not some other regulator, it's the readers themselves. So some way, and there's a way to kind of give people tax credits or vouchers or subsidies or something, but they have to use that to buy news. And in any case, the idea, though, that the kind of main sort of message I'm trying to get across is that we've kind of grown up, some of us grew up in an era when funding of news was not a particularly big issue. And so, it had its problems, and there was lots of cultural critiques about commercially based journalism, a lot of them very valid, but there are a lot of merits to the system too, and one of the main merits is that it was large and powerful. So, CBS was a very powerful news organization, and the Chicago Tribune was a very powerful newspaper in Chicago, where I worked in the Providence Journal. It was very powerful in its region. The Wall Street Journal was a very powerful newspaper in the investment community and financial world, still is, but it was really powerful back then. And people have misgivings about media power, and I understand that, but when you sort of think about it, journalism is in its ideal form is really there to represent the public interest. That's the only thing that exists that would do that outside of government. So you want powerful journalism organizations. Why do you want them? Because they're covering organizations that are far more powerful than they are. So the Wall Street Journal, for instance, had to cover Goldman Sachs. Now, who's more powerful, Goldman Sachs or the Wall Street Journal? Well, I'll tell you who is. Goldman. And that's just the truth. Who's more powerful, the New York Times or the Pentagon? Well, the Pentagon, of course. I mean, they have $1 trillion budget. So, you know, so people who have misgivings about institutional media and powerful media, I get it. But on the other hand, you have to be careful about, you know, I don't think you benefit from I don't think anyone, frankly, benefits from a weakened journalism system.
So from the perspective of a journalist, what do you think, how the speed of publications affect the length of the research and the way of reporting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I kind of come across as this sort of internet curmudgeon sometimes, and it's like, it's new and I don't like it and all that. I do like it, you know, and it's transformative, and we don't really know how it's all going to work out, but you know, it's been a thing that the internet giveth and it taketh away, right? And first it took away the revenue. So that's a huge problem. I mean, I don't even have to talk about other problems. That's already a problem. But in taking away the revenue, you've reduced the number of jobs that you have, meaning that fewer numbers of people are producing the same or more amounts of copy, leading to quality problems. Okay. The other problem is, of course, that the internet, digital publishing, at least certainly in its early incarnation and even today, rewards volume. Why? Because, and if you notice, like the Huffington Post and other successful digital publications, there's all sorts of stuff there constantly changing and stuff like that. And the reason it is if you're relying on digital ads, you are hoping for that thing that goes viral. You want lots of page views and unique visitors, like flooding your site so that you can charge advertisers for all those eyeballs. And the trouble with that is that you never really know exactly what's going to go viral, and something that took 3 hours to do, whether it could be anything, you know, a video of cats or whatever, something cleverly done, or an investigation into public contracting in Budapest that took 3 months. You never know, like, which of those two is going to produce the most page views. In fact, the public corruption investigation might do very poorly. And so there's no economic reason for, you can do public service journalism online. It just doesn't really make any economic sense. So it's hard to ask people to do things that make no sense, right? I mean, you know, especially if it's a commercial operation. It's like, why should they have to do something that is not in their economic interest? So internet companies, digital publishers, recognizing this dynamic of internet economics, began to ramp up productivity requirements for news staffs. And and I studied it, you know, there you notice that I studied it at the Wall Street Journal between 2000 and 2008 because for several reasons. One is that I was able to get the data about the number of employees at the organization and number of journalists in the newsroom and stuff like that. Anyway, it increased, you know, output per reporter more than doubled during that period. So in the first part of the era, the paper staff produced like 20,000 stories a year, 22,000 stories a year, which is a lot. But they were able to do this sort of epic work that, you know, that helped keep corporate America, you know, in check. By the end of the period, they a smaller staff was producing somewhere along the lines of 40,000, 45,000 stories per year, basically, so that, and then the number of stories per reporter rose dramatically from the 60s to near 200, and you sort of divide that by the number of hours in a day and the number of days in a week, and you can kind of see that reporters are producing more copy in a much more compressed time frame. So this is talking, this impacts quality, this impacts depth, this impacts accuracy, it impacts all of the things that generate value and trust in a news organization. So the more you kind of play the digital ad game, the more you're sort of undermining your subscription game. Because the subscription game should be about quality and integrity and trust and this good vibe you get from a news organization that you trust. So these are things that sort of are at odds. So that is the newspaper industry sort of rush to be free and to be cool and to be sort of internety and techy. They began to sort of churn out vast amounts of copy of declining quality, and then as internet sort of reaped its havoc on news finance, as it kept shedding reporters and shedding more reporters and increasing quantity and decreasing quality, all the while undermining any hope for building a model that would earn the support and the hard-earned money of readers. So that sort of frenzy has really taken a disastrous toll on news organizations. The productivity and the kind of, I called it the hamster wheel in an essay, that has been sort of probably the sort of, I think, one of the single most important issues about affecting sort of the integrity and the quality of our news system, and the first thing we have to do is get away from a system or an economic model that rewards quantity and that rewards volume and that rewards randomness, and move to find a business model of some kind of model that rewards being on the news and being very aggressive in keeping up with constantly changing events, but also doing so in a way that's deep, that's well informed, that provides perspective, that provides coherent analysis, and that provides some kind of measure of storytelling and just providing a very high quality report, and that's sort of whatever sustains that kind of product is the business model you're looking for.